Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Please support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making the audiobook series. Salah ad-Deen al-Ayubi, Volume 2, The Establishment of the Ayyubid State. Start of Part 3 of Chapter 7. The First Siege of Mosul. Political developments in Syria, Mesopotamia and Mosul after the death of Saleh Ismail prompted Salah ad-Din to leave Egypt and head eastwards in order to be closer to the events that were unfolding there, so that he could intervene when circumstances dictated it. He regarded the way in which Izz-ad-Din Masud I was running the affairs of Aleppo as contrary to the treaty that had been drawn up between the Ayyubids and Zengids, because this city and its neighboring citadels belonged to him by the Abbasid Caliph's decree. Furthermore, this breach of the treaty could lead to the end of the mission of Islamic unity that he was striving to achieve. Hence he took many steps on his way eastwards aimed at disconnecting Aleppo from what was around it. He asked his nephew Taqi ad-Din Umar, ruler of Hama, Farrukh Shah, ruler of Damascus, and other emirs to attack the regions west of Mesopotamia and annex them to the Ayyubid possessions, and to prevent the army of Mosul from crossing the Euphrates. But Taqi ad-Din Umar was unable to prevent Izz-ad-Din Masud I from entering Aleppo. Farrukh Shah was also preoccupied with withstanding the efforts of Renaud de Chatillon to invade the Arabian Peninsula, to which end the latter had set out from the fortress of Kirak. Salah ad-Din wrote a letter to the Abbasid Caliph an-Nasir li-Dinillah, in which he continued his efforts and jihad for the sake of Islam and the great things he had achieved for the Abbasid Caliphate. He explained his role in the downfall of the Fatimid Caliphate and the restoration of Abbasid authority in Egypt. He also described to him the bad situation in Syria, the vulnerability of Harim to crusader attacks, the betrayal of the ruler of Mosul, the transgressions of the Aleppan troops against his possessions, and their seeking help from the crusaders, and their correspondence with the assassins with the aim of cooperating with them against the Islamic unity mission he was striving to achieve. He reminded him that the Caliph al-Mustadi bi Amrillah had given him authority over Aleppo and its environs, and that he had only given it up for the sake of the son of Nuruddin Mahmud. But now he could not but ask for his rights. He expressed that by saying, "Now let everyone who had a right take what is his due, and let everyone be content with this lot." For his part, Izz-ad-Din Masud I made a move towards the crusaders, in order to win them over and urge them to attack the Muslim borders, so as to distract Salah ad-Din from targeting his territory. Salah ad-Din was very annoyed by the betrayal of the ruler of Mosul, so he decided to focus his attention on the areas of northern Syria and Mesopotamia. He headed towards Aleppo and Mosul, and was joined in his march to Aleppo by Muzaffar ad-Din Kokaburi, the ruler of Haran, who suggested to him that he should cross the Euphrates and capture the land lying to the east before heading towards Aleppo, so that he would not be distracted from it by anything else, and he promised to help him. It is worth mentioning that Kokaburi had a dispute with the ruler of Mosul and his deputy Kaimaz, who had dismissed him from his post as governor of Irbil. Salah ad-Din set out towards Aleppo with the approval of the Caliph, and besieged it for 3 days in Jamadiul Awwal, that is September, after which he moved towards Mosul in order to capture it from the Zengids, preferring to annex Mesopotamia and its fortresses beforehand. He crossed the Euphrates at Beraa, the ruler of which was Shihab ad-Din Muhammad ibn Ilyas al-Artuqi, who was loyal to Salah ad-Din. The Artuqids in Hasan Kaif and Mardin then announced their loyalty to him and joined his army. The cities of Mesopotamia began to fall to him, one after another: Edessa, Suruj, Nusaybin, Raqqa, Khabur, and others. He appointed Kokaburi as governor of Edessa, Husam ad-Din Abul Hayja as-Samin as governor of Nusaybin, and he gave Khabur to Jamal ad-Din Khushtarin. Thus Salah ad-Din succeeded in gaining control of all of the Yar Mudar in the Jazira region and forming an alliance opposed to the Emir of Mosul. There was now nothing left for him to do but head towards Mosul and subjugate it. In fact, Mosul was a source of worry for him and an obstacle that stood in the way of achieving his aims. So he decided that he had no alternative but to conquer it, if he could not gain its support and cooperation. He realized that he could not realize his objective unless he annexed Mosul, Sinjar, and Jazirat ibn Umar. Salah ad-Din arrived in Mosul in Rajab 578 Hijri, that is December 1182 Common Era, and laid a concentrated siege to the city. Then he soon attacked it, but he did not breach its defenses. It proved to be a difficult target for him because of its fortifications, the strength of its walls, and the huge preparations that had been made by Izz-ad-Din Masud I and his deputy Qaimaz. They had mobilized large number of troops to defend it, using weapons which included stupendous siege machines. During the siege, Salah ad-Din undertook reconnaissance around the city, and it became clear to him that it was impossible to breach it. In the meantime, the ruler of Mosul took measures to seek help from allies all around. He sent Al-Qadi Bahad-Din ibn Shaddad to Baghdad to seek the help of the Abbasid Caliph in repelling Salah ad-Din from his land, and the Caliph wrote to Sadr ad-Din Sheikh al-Shayukh, who was with Salah ad-Din, ordering him to mediate between the two sides. He sought help from Kizil Arsalan, the ruler of Azerbaijan, Bahlawan ibn Ildakaz, the Atabeg of Hamatan, and Bakhtamar Sukman, the ruler of Khallat. None of them tried to help except Bakhtamar, who sent word to Salah ad-Din asking him to accept his intercession and to stay away from Mosul. Despite the fact that Salah ad-Din sent Bakhtamar's envoys away, all these factors prompted him to rethink his plans to annex Mosul by force, and he decided to use diplomatic means instead. It seems that he found himself in a difficult position and was afraid of losing his status as a mujahid for the sake of Islam due to appearing to harbor ambitions against the state of Mosul. So he suggested a peace deal to Izz-ad-Din Masud I, who asked him to return the lands that had been taken from him. Salah ad-Din agreed to that on condition that he did not object to the annexation of Aleppo, but the ruler of Mosul refused to betray his brother and was keen for his brother to keep his authority in Aleppo, and announced that he was prepared to help him if he was faced with danger. Annexation of Sinjar. As a result of the failure of negotiations between the two sides, Salah ad-Din decided to put more pressure on Mosul and isolate it from Aleppo. Sinjar was the city that gave him the opportunity to carry out his plan. Hence he lifted the siege of Mosul and went to Sinjar on 16 Shaban, 576 Hijri, that is 15 December, 1182 Common Era. He notified the Caliph of what he had decided to do. He besieged the city for 15 days until it fell to him. Consequences of the Annexation of Sinjar. The annexation of Sinjar provoked the emirs of Mesopotamia, who called one another to a defensive alliance against Salah ad-Deen's policy, as they were aggravated by his penetration into the Mesopotamia region and his annexation of Sinjar, which threatened their security. This alliance consisted of Shah Arman Sukman, ruler of Khallat, Qutbuddin ibn Najmuddin Albi, ruler of Mardin, Daulat Shah, ruler of Batlis and Arzan, in addition to Izzuddin Masood I. The allies went out to confront him, taking advantage of the fact that his army was scattered throughout Mesopotamia and camped in Harzum, on the outskirts of Mardin. When he learned of their march, he gathered his army and marched to Ras Al Ain to meet them. It seems that they were afraid to enter into battle, so they scattered and returned to their homelands. Thus Izzuddin Masood I failed in his attempt to expel Salah ad-Din from Mesopotamia, despite the support of some of its emirs. He no longer had the power to put any obstacles in the way of Salah ad-Din's ventures in the region. Annexation of Amid. Salah ad-Din took advantage of the division and weakness among his opponents and went to Amid, after seeking permission from the Caliph an-Nasir li-Dinillah to attack it, which was granted to him. Nuruddin Muhammad, the ruler of Hasan Kaf, had urged him to attack it and capture it and hand it over to him, in accordance with the agreement between them. Salah ad-Din reached Amid on 17 Dhul-Hijjah, 578 Hijri, that is 15th April 1183 Common Era, and laid siege to it. Its provisional ruler, Muhammad ibn Ildakaz, was weak and had no authority except in name only. Its actual ruler was Baha'u'ddin ibn Nisan, who was known for his miserliness and bad conduct, and for withholding provisions and assets from the inhabitants of the city. During this time, Salah ad-Din sent letters to the prominent emirs of Amid, making promises and issuing threats if they persisted in fighting. These circumstances led to the inhabitants becoming unfocused and careless in defending the city. So Ibn Nisan was forced to ask for safe passage for himself and his family, and to ask Salah ad-Din to give him 3 days to move his personal property and treasures. After the end of this period, he handed the city over to Salah ad-Din on 10 Muharram 579 Hijri, that is 16th May 1183 Common Era, and Salah ad-Din in turn handed it and its environs over to Nuruddin Muhammad. He ordered Nuruddin to establish justice and put an end to injustice, and to hear and obey the Sultan with regard to facing their enemies and showing kindness to their allies at all times, and told him that any time he asked for reinforcements from Amid to fight the Franks, he should find them ready. Annexation of Aleppo. After taking over areas of Mesopotamia that were adjacent to the Emirate of Aleppo, Salah ad-Din decided to annex them into his possessions before taking Mosul. So he crossed the Euphrates and camped at Tel Khalid on the outskirts of Aleppo, and besieged it until it surrendered in Muharram 579 Hijri, that is May 1183 Common Era. Then he traveled from there to Aintab, that is Gaziantep, the ruler of which, Nasir ad-Din Muhammad ibn Khimar Taghin, offered allegiance to him, and asked him to leave him in position in charge of his emirate. Salah ad-Din agreed to that, then moved on from Aintab to Aleppo. where he camped on 22nd Muharram, that is 21 May, but he did not initiate the fighting. Rather, he camped in a place known as the Green Field. Then he moved a few days later to Mount Jaushan and gave Imad ad-Din Zangi II the impression that he was building lodgings there for himself and his troops, so as to force him to surrender, thus avoiding bloodshed. Imad ad-Din Zangi II was forced to begin negotiations with Salah ad-Din for the handover of the city, and the Emir Husam ad-Din Tuman acted as mediator between them. The negotiations ended with the following conclusions. 1. Imad ad-Din Zangi II was to give Aleppo to Salah ad-Din. 2. Salah ad-Din was to give Imad ad-Din Zangi II Sinjar, Khabur, Nusaybin, and Suruj. 3. Salah ad-Din was to give Husam ad-Din Tuman and Raqqah. And 4. Imad ad-Din Zangi II was to put his military forces at the disposal of Salah ad-Din whenever he asked him to. Salah ad-Din entered Aleppo after the conclusion of this deal on 17 Safar 579 Hijri, that is 18 June 1183 Common Era, and was welcomed by its inhabitants. Consequences of the annexation of Aleppo. As a result of Salah ad-Din's annexation of Aleppo, his position was strengthened and the Islamic front became more cohesive. He became so powerful that he was able to focus on fighting the crusaders. Thus their fears increased. They regarded this event as the greatest crisis they had ever faced. In addition to that, it strengthened political and military ties between Egypt and Greater Syria. The Crusader kingdoms in Greater Syria found themselves besieged along this axis. Bohemond III, ruler of Antioch, asked Salah ad-Din for security, and he granted him a truce so as to allow himself time to perfect his plans to unite the Muslim world in the Near East. Second Siege of Mosul. Soon new developments in Mosul forced Salah ad-Din once again to intervene in its affairs. In Jamadul Awwal, 579 Hijri, that is September 1183 Common Era, Izz-ad-Din Masood I listened to the incitement of some of his senior emirs against his deputy, Mujahid ad-Din Qaymaz, against whom they shared a strong enmity. Izz-ad-Din arrested him, imprisoned him, and confiscated his property. Irbil, Jazirat ibn Umar, Jahrazur, Takuka, and Khallat al-Hamidiyya were all under the rule of Qaymaz, administered by deputies in his name. When he was arrested, these deputies decided to rebel. Both Zain ad-Din Yusuf, the governor of Irbil, and Muiz ad-Din Sanjar Shah, the governor of Jazirat ibn Umar, sent letters of loyalty to Salah ad-Din, and these two cities came under his control. By means of this irresponsible attitude, Izz-ad-Din Masood I contributed to the weakening of his own position vis-à-vis Salah ad-Din. Izz-ad-Din inclined towards diplomacy and sent Al-Qadi Bahad-Din ibn Shaddad to the Abbasid Caliph in Shawwal 579 Hijri, that is January 1184 Common Era, asking him to intervene again to bring about a reconciliation between him and Salah ad-Din. The Caliph responded to his request and sent Sheikh al-Shayukh and Bashir al-Khadim to Damascus to negotiate with Salah ad-Din for a solution to the problems between him and the ruler of Mosul. Muhyiddin al-Shahrazuri joined them as the representative of the ruler of Mosul, accompanied by Al-Qadi ibn Shaddad. The negotiations came to a dead end, however, because Salah ad-Din insisted that the rulers of Irbil and Jazirat ibn Umar should have the freedom to choose whether they joined him or the ruler of Mosul. This position was rejected by the representative of Izz-ad-Din Masood I, who insisted that they should follow the ruler of Mosul and that their names should be mentioned in the treaty document. So the envoys went back without having achieved anything. Izz-ad-Din Masood, who had put himself in this dilemma, realized that the situation was critical and regretted what he had done to his deputy, and he tried to rectify matters. He released him from prison and restored to him his former authority. Mujahid ad-Din Qaymaz came out of prison at a time when Mosul had lost some of its power and the morale of those in authority was on the decline. So he strove to restore the strength of the various branches of the state, including the army, asking for help from neighboring forces. He succeeded in his attempt to win over Khazal, the ruler of Azerbaijan, who supplied him with 3,000 troops. After he became certain of his ability to take action, he decided to recapture the cities that the Atabegs had lost. He attacked Erbil, but he failed to breach its walls. Salah ad-Din was not unaware of what was going on, and he decided to intervene in the interests of his allies and ad-Din Yusuf, the ruler of Erbil, and after that to head towards Mosul to wrest it from the clutches of Izz-ad-Din Masood I. He soon mobilized his forces and set out, leading them to Haran in Safar 581 Hijri, that is May 1185 Common Era. He camped at Ras al-Ain, then he went to Dunaysar, where he was joined by Imad ad-Din ibn Qara Arsalan al-Artuki and the troops of his brother Nuruddin Muhammad, the ruler of Hasan Kaif and Amid. They marched together to Nusaybin, where they were joined by Mu'izz ad-Din Sanjar Shah ibn Saif ad-Din Ghazi I, ruler of Jazirat ibn Umar. Salah ad-Din continued to march towards Mosul and camped in Ismailiyat, which is close to the city in Rabiul Awal, 581 Hijri, that is June 1185 Common Era. To reinforce his position, he sent a letter to the Abbasid Caliph telling him of his decision to settle matters with Mosul. He indicated that the people of Mosul were giving Friday sermons and issuing coinage in the name of Tughrul the Seljuk, the Sultan of Persia and the opponent of the Caliph, as well as corresponding with the crusaders and inciting them to attack Muslim lands. He also mentioned that his decision was not based on any ambition to expand his own realm or get rid of the Zangis. Rather, it was to bring them back to obeying the Caliph and supporting Islam, to prevent them from committing injustice and transgressing the sacred limits, and to cut off their relationship with the Seljuks of Persia and force them to respect their neighbors' rights and uphold the ties of kinship. The pressure on Izz-ad-Din Masood I was intense, and he felt helpless, so he was inclined to reach a deal. He headed a delegation which included the daughter of his paternal uncle, Nuruddin Mahmud and other women, and a number of prominent figures, to seek a reconciliation and an end to the siege of Mosul. Salah ad-Din would have accepted this offer of reconciliation were it not for the objection of al-Faqih Isa al-Hakari and the Amir Ali ibn Ahmad al-Mashtub, who warned him against accepting this offer and said, "A city like Mosul should not be given up for the sake of a woman." Izz-ad-Din Masood only sent the women because he was unable to protect the city. Salah ad-Din was convinced by their argument and gave his apologies to the delegation from Mosul and continued to besiege the city. However, there were many obstacles in his way, so he was forced to lift the siege of Mosul. Among the most important of these obstacles were the following. 1. The people of Mosul were able to go out from the eastern side and fight the Ayyubid forces. then return into the city, which put pressure on Salah ad-Din's forces. 2. Qaimars had strengthened the fortifications of the city and reorganized the army, so that they were able to resist the Ayyubid attacks, and the troops fought courageously to defend the city. And 3. The siege of Mosul occurred during the summer, when temperatures were very high, so Salah ad-Din ordered a halt of military operations until the temperature dropped. It so happened that water levels in the Tigris fell at that time, so the engineer suggested to Salah ad-Din that he should divert the course of the river away from Mosul to cut off water for its inhabitants, so that they would become thirsty and would be forced to surrender. But Salah ad-Din thought that this project would take more time than he had, and a lot of effort that would exhaust the troops. During the siege, it so happened that Shah Arman, the ruler of Khallat, died without leaving a son to succeed him, and Nuruddin Muhammad, the ruler of Amid and Hasan Kaif, also died. Salah ad-Din felt he ought to organize the affairs of the Artukid Emirates in a way that served his aims. Attempt to annex Khallat. One of the Mamluks of Shah Arman, whose name was Saif ad-Din Bakhtamar, took charge in Khallat after the death of its ruler. Salah ad-Din hoped to annex the city and consulted his general staff concerning that. Some of them suggested that he continue besieging Mosul, whilst others advised him to travel to Khallat and take over the city on the grounds that it would be a first step towards taking over the other citadels in the area. As a result of this difference of opinions, Salah ad-Din hesitated, did not know what decision to make until he received letters from the people of Khallat, summoning him so that they could hand over the city to him. In fact, Shams ad-Din Pahlawan ibn Ildakas, the ruler of Azerbaijan and Hamdan, hoped to take over Khallat when he found out about the death of Shah Arman. Bakhtamar was afraid that he would lose his position if this happened, and the people of Khallat refused to submit to Pahlawan. To prevent him coming and taking over the city, Bakhtamar came to an agreement with the prominent people of the city to write to Salah ad-Din, saying that they agreed to give their allegiance to him. Their intention, however, was to set the two sides against one another so that the city would remain in their hands. Salah ad-Din headed towards Khallat without knowing the intentions of Bakhtamar. In his vanguard were his cousin Nasir ad-Din Muhammad ibn Shirkuh, Muzaffar ad-Din, son of the ruler of Haran, and others. They camped in Tawana, near Khallat, and he sent al-Faqih Isa al-Hakari and Ghars ad-Din Khilij Arsalan to Khallat to discuss the terms of the handover. He himself headed towards Mayafariqin to annex it. As for Pahlawan, he had marched towards Khallat and camped near the city. Then the envoys of Bakhtamar went back and forth between the two sides. They warned Pahlawan that if he attacked Khallat, Bakhtamar would hand the city over to Salah ad-Din, but Pahlawan was able to win Bakhtamar over and gave him his daughter in marriage. Bakhtamar apologized to the envoys of Salah ad-Din, who went back without having achieved their aim. Thus Salah ad-Din's efforts to take over Khallat failed. For his part, Qutbuddin Sukman, who had succeeded his father as ruler of Amid and Hasan Kaif, offered his loyalty to Salah ad-Din for fear that he might take Amid back from him. Annexation of Mayafariqin. Mayafariqin was under the rule of Husam ad-Din Ulugh ibn Qutbuddin al-Ghazi, ruler of Mardin, who was 10 years old. In it was a garrison belonging to Shah Arman, the ruler of Khallat, and its troops were led by Asad ad-Din Jarankash, who had refused to come under Salah ad-Din's banner and had declared his rebellion. Salah ad-Din was forced to besiege the city, but was not able to breach its defenses, so he decided to use a political ruse. He contacted the widow of Qutbuddin who was living there and gave her the impression that Jarankash had made an agreement with him to surrender the city. He also sent word to Jarankash, telling him that this lady was inclined towards a peace deal. By means of this subterfuge, he annexed the city on 29 Jamadiul Awwal, 581 Hijri, that is 28 August, 1185 Common Era. At that point, a letter reached Salah ad-Din from the Abbasid Caliph, appointing him in charge of the Arbakir and of taking care of its king's orphans. Thus Friday sermons were given and coinage was minted in his name in the Artukid provinces. Third Siege of Mosul. Salah ad-Din takes over. When Salah ad-Din had finished with Mayafariqin, he returned to Mosul to besiege it for the third time. He travelled via Nusaybin, reaching Kafar Zanhar in Shaban 581 Common Era, where he stayed until winter ended. Then the envoy of Izz-ad-Din Masud, ruler of Mosul, came seeking a peace deal. Salah ad-Din fell ill at that time and went to Haran. So Izz-ad-Din Masud I took advantage of this opportunity to renew his attempts to make an agreement with him. After having despaired of getting support from the Caliph and the Persian ruler, he sent Bahad-Din ibn Shaddad, giving him the authority to sign a peace deal. The peace deal between the two sides stated the following. 1. Izz-ad-Din Masud, the Atabeg of Mosul, was to hand over to Salah ad-Din Shahrazur and its environs, the province of Qurabi and all the territory beyond Zab, as well as the province of Bani Qafhaq. 2. Salah ad-Din was to give up Mosul and its environs to Izz-ad-Din Masud Zangi, which would be under his administration, but would belong to Salah ad-Din as a self-governing area within the framework of the Ayyubid state. 3. Izz-ad-Din Masud would be obliged to order that Friday sermons be given in the name of Salah ad-Din on the pulpits in the city and surrounding areas, and his government was to stop giving Friday sermons in the name of the Seljuks in those areas. Izz-ad-Din Masud also agreed to mint coins in the name of Salah ad-Din in that land. 4. Izz-ad-Din Masud and his troops were obliged to be at the service of Salah ad-Din whenever he called him, and both sides were to take part in the jihad against the crusaders and the fight to take back Palestine. And 5. Both sides promised to adhere to the previous agreement, the terms of which had been agreed verbally in Zulhaj 581 Hijri, that is the 3rd of March, 1186 Common Era. This deal would continue to be in effect, and Salah ad-Din adhered to this deal and never changed it until he died. By means of this agreement, Salah ad-Din was able to unite the Islamic front under his leadership and become the strongest Muslim ruler in the region. Now that this had been achieved, he had to strive to achieve the greater goal, which was to liberate Jerusalem and the rest of the Muslim lands from the Crusader invaders. Regarding the relationship between Salah ad-Din and the Zangid dynasty, at a time when some historians among his contemporaries and certain modern researchers have expressed doubts about Salah ad-Din's motives and his relationship with the Zangid dynasty, it may be stated that this doubt can be rendered baseless on the following counts. Salah ad-Din was very eager in his correspondence with the Abbasid Caliph to explain in precise detail the motives for his actions. 2. The motive that was the justification for his actions always came back to the jihad against the crusaders and the liberation of Jerusalem, as well as the urgent need to unite the Muslim ranks for the purpose of developing jihad and succeeding in it. And 3. In his dealings with Zangids, Salah ad-Din was very eager in his correspondence with the Abbasid Caliph to explain, in precise detail, the motives for his actions. The motive that was the justification for his actions always came back to the jihad against the crusaders and the liberation of Jerusalem, as well as the urgent need to unite the Muslim ranks for the purpose of developing jihad and succeeding in it. In his dealings with the Zangids, Salah ad-Din was always generous after he defeated them in battle, as well as in the way he besieged them. After achieving the union of Egypt and Syria, and ensuring the support of Mosul, Salah ad-Din immediately began to achieve his second goal, which formed his main concern, which was to destroy the field army of the Latin kingdom and conquer Jerusalem. We shall see below that the first aim was achieved in the Battle of Hattin, the outcome of which was impacted by his ability to mobilize a huge, united Islamic force at the right time and in the right place. The achievement of the second goal came after the Battle of Hattin and as a result of his victory in that battle. One of the characteristics that distinguished Salah ad-Din in the peace deal with Mosul was his generosity. It is recorded that he did not leave the Mosul region until he had given its ruler, his mother, his wife, the daughter of Nuruddin, and a number of prominent men of state great gifts worth more than 10,000 dinars, in addition to horses, perfumes, unique gifts, and clothing. Furthermore, after he had recovered from his illness, he traveled with his brother Al-Adil at the beginning of 582 Common Era to Aleppo, then to Damascus, and he wrote to all his governors telling them to pay sadaqah. In Damascus alone, he paid sadaqah of 5,000 Egyptian dinars. End of part 3 of chapter 7.